راح اشرب قهوة. ايوه. والله.
Hello. Erhan, nice Massad. Nice to meet you.
Assalamu alaikum. This is session 5, and the title of the session is The Challenge of Colonialism. We will have 3 presentations. This session will be moderated by Dr. Erhan Icener. Dr. Erhan is an associate professor and vice chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Middle East Technical University and a master's degree with distinction in European integration and a PhD in European studies from Queen's University in Belfast. He received a scholarship for his master's degree and a postgraduate research student scholarship, as well as University Association for Contemporary European Studies scholarship for his PhD. His study was entitled Explaining European Union Enlargement, a comparative study of Romania and Turkey. Dr. Icener's research and publications focus on EU enlargement, its external relations, Turkey and Romania's integration with the EU, and the Cyprus issue. His work has published many peer-reviewed journal publications, as well as several chapters on EU enlargement and other related issues. Dr. Icener will moderate and will introduce the speakers. Dr. Icener.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. I would like to welcome you again. This is our actually last session before the lunch and the closing debate, where many of you will be involved, I guess. And after looking at the issues like sectarianism, secularism, nationalism, and modernization issues, in this session we are going to look at actually the legacy of colonialism, especially in that region in Middle East. And we have 3 distinguished speakers and the papers to be presented in this panel. First of all, I would like to present you the speakers. The first speaker will be Mujeeb Khan. He was a Fulbright Research Fellow in the Persian Gulf and has published extensively on the politics and history of the modern Middle East. He has publications on East European politics and societies, Arab studies journals, and Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs. He holds degrees in political science from the University of Chicago and Berkeley. Our second speaker will be Professor Joseph Massad, is Professor of Modern Arab Politics and Intellectual History at Columbia University. Again, as you very well know, he is the author of dozens of books and academic and journalistic articles. And finally, our last speaker will be Dr. Professor Sami Al-Arian. Again, as you know, he is the main organizer of this conference and director and the founder of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Sabahattin Zaim University. And he received his PhD in computer engineering in 1986 in United States, and he has been teaching in United States before coming to Turkey. Our first paper will be presented by Mujeeb Khan. Each of the speakers will have 20 minutes per speech, per paper. And the title of the presentation is, I think, a century after the Sykes-Picot. I think there is a slight change in the title of the paper. A critical analysis of the post-Ottoman Middle East.
Oh, I'm trying to get this. It's not. Do we? No. Okay. Okay. Don't use that one? Okay. Okay. Çok teşekkür ederim. Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Arian and Istanbul Zaim University, for this chance to be in beautiful Istanbul. When you think of Istanbul, you think again of what was the historic capital for almost 5 centuries of a major part of the Islamic world. And just recently, these connections between past and present keep recurring, sometimes in very melancholic and tragic ways. There's an article recently, just this week in The Economist, about how Istanbul has become the capital of the Arab world again, meaning that so many of the dissidents and people fleeing oppression and war and strife have found refuge here. And this touches us a lot in many personal ways. I was at a conference just 4 months ago on authoritarianism and democratic decline in the Middle East, and it's a very similar kind of pamphlet that you have right here with the speakers and so on. Our keynote speaker was this person. You recognize him? Jamal Khashoggi. And it's very tragic that not far from here, many of the themes I'm going to be talking about today, about why this region has become, since Sykes-Picot, which was a century ago, a site of endemic war and authoritarianism. So I'd like to offer a theory here that's going to borrow from international relations theory to look at the interconnections between endemic systemic conflict and war and authoritarianism. And the first question would be to ask, well, where is, has this changed it again, hold on. One.
There's no synchronization.
Oh, there's no synchronization? Let me see.
You have the clicker?
I was trying the clicker, but let me see.
There.
Okay, so then we go down, is that how it goes? No. Okay, I think it's working. Okay, so the first term is, to define where is the Middle East. How would we define this? There's actually a book by Roderick Davison, which attempts to define this. And the very term is, of course, very loaded one, because it's in reference to Europe and its perception of what the Proche-Orient or Nahe Osten or the Middle East is. And even then, the exact boundaries are not clear, because sometimes it was defined as simply the Arab Middle East. At other times, of course, includes Turkey and Iran, but does it include the Maghreb? Does it include Afghanistan and Pakistan? The definition I would take is a little broader one, which is to say that it properly defined in terms of interaction and in cross-cutting influences that carry over. And by this broader definition, you would include both the Maghreb as well as Afghanistan and Pakistan, as some of our speakers today made clear. Now, the current outlines of systemic conflict that I'd like to explicate have their origins, of course, as I mentioned, Sykes-Picot, and perhaps even a little earlier, which was the rise of the Ottoman Eastern Question. And these two overlapped because the Eastern Question itself and the breakup of the Ottoman state was very much linked to the assassination in Sarajevo and the Ottoman entry into war. It actually, though, was also heavily influenced by developments in the 19th century. And these are some of them which I would like to show how past and present came together here. One important issue that I wanted to deal with was the origins of the Muslim question in Europe and how these things are linked over time. So you had the rise of the Muslim question, and I've written an article on the origins of war, genocide, and ethnic cleansing to show that how this arises with Russia's entry into the Crimea and the Balkans, and the uprisings that took place in Greece and Serbia, which entailed a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing of Ottoman Muslim populations. And this carried over through the 19th century and heavily shaped a lot of the debates and issues we were talking about today. But what's important here is that it also shows the importance of issues of identity and how these carry over through time as well. Recently there was a post by the Deputy Prime Minister in Turkey of a letter written by Burmese Muslims in Rangoon that was calling for the British authorities in India to intervene to help the Ottoman Muslims who were being ethnically cleansed in the Balkans. The connection that was being drawn here clearly was that these feelings of belonging, even though they were across a great distance in time and space of populations that really had no direct contact with one another, was very evocative. But it's also something that wasn't just in the 19th century. It's something that's very much with us today. If we look at events that happened in Bosnia not so long ago and that are happening very much today in Burma. And at the same time, there was the question of what was international responsibility, and primarily of leading Western powers at the time in terms of intervention to stop genocide and ethnic cleansing that were taking place. And those issues of identity matters in international relations, are still very much with us. This occurred to me in examining the case of Turkey, because I was very active during the Bosnian conflict and genocide in the 90s as a young activist and student in both the United States as well as in Turkey and the Middle East. And I was here for an international conference, and there was a very large demonstration following the conference, and there was this chant in Istiklal, in Taksim Square, where there's a huge demonstration, which was saying "Ordu, Ordu, Bosna ya, Musulman burada, laikler nerede." And it had actually a very profound impact going forward in looking at the transformation in debates about Turkish foreign policy, national identity, and orientation. Because it was given in my own interviews at that time with people in the Turkish foreign ministry who thought that the West would intervene. That they very much bought into the rhetoric of the New World Order that happened after Iraq, and that there was such a thing, and that differences in religion and identity and so on didn't matter. But as the war went on and then the genocide took place in Srebrenica, they were very much disabused by this. So it had a profound impact, but it's one that carried over from earlier, and these are still issues that we deal with today. Now, looking at the breakup of the Ottoman state, and what came, if we look at the conflicts that have emerged post Sykes-Picot, it's telling that one of the first things that the French, of course, did in the provinces of Greater Syria, which they took control of in the Mandate in 1918, was they endeavored to create a Maronite state, Druze state, and an Alawite state. And the British endeavored to create a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And of course, we had similar sorts of divisions that took place in Mesopotamia. And it's it's of course no wonder that much of the crises and conflicts we see today are revolving around these very same issues. Now, in terms of the breakup of the Ottoman state, it was an assumption in the historiography that this was a sick man of Europe, that the Ottoman state was on the brink of collapse, and that this would have happened absent Western intervention. This is not true. If you look at the more recent historiography, it's a recent work by D.K. Fieldhouse as well, the historian at Cambridge, what he shows, I think, convincingly, is that the Ottoman state was actually reforming. It was actually quite capable and robust, and we saw that during even the First World War with its defeat of very powerful Western armies in Çanakkale and Kut el-Amara. But one reason why this kind of myth had prevailed was that this assumption that nationalism of an ethnic linguistic sort had emerged, especially in the Arab provinces, to divide the Ottoman state. And earlier work by C. Ernest Dawn, William Oxenwald, and others showed it was not true. There's a recent work on Mesopotamia by Charles Townshend, who's actually the grandson of the British general who was defeated there. And he gives a very telling account of how, as the Ottoman armies were defeated and they were being taken prisoner and marched back north from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the local population south of Baghdad thought that their army was returning victorious. And this was a largely Arab Shia population. And they started cheering and yelling Allahu Akbar, and they were very excited. And then they noticed that a soldier told them to be quiet, who was an Ottoman soldier who was a prisoner, and that they were being guarded by British soldiers on the flanks. And then they all started to mourn and yell, how did our army lose? What has happened to us? What has happened to our army? What we're seeing now, I think, is a questioning of a lot of these assumptions that were rooted in the breakup of the Ottoman state in the 19th century. What we're seeing is, now what I want to do is I want to segue from this kind of historical background and how these sort of the framework for the emergence of the modern Middle East took place post-World War I, to look at popular explanations for why this region over the last century has become a site of so much endemic conflict and strife. And a lot of these explanations, of course, tend towards this ancient hatreds model. We had also these accounts of, sectarian hatreds and so on, going back thousands of years. These are, of course, not true. They're quite facile and not true because much of Europe was itself a site for this kinds of endemic conflicts through the 19th and early 20th century. And the Middle East or West Asia was not. Now, are there historical precedents for how these regions become sites of these kinds of endemic conflict? A lot of it, the argument I'm going to make is that a lot of it has to do with overlapping notions of belonging, overlapping notions of identity, and then penetration of a region by external forces pursuing a strategy of divide and rule. And so this is not unique. You saw that when you had fragmentations of regional state systems, for example, the Greek city-state system during the Peloponnesian War, the Italian city-state system, or even Europe and the German-speaking lands during the 30 Years' War. You had this similar patterns of ongoing conflict and external intervention, which was meant to keep this fragmentation in place. And so we have a similar situation now in the Middle East, post-Sykes-Picot, and it has actually been maintained in a specific form or valent sense, the emergence of the Cold War in 1950. And so a number of scholars have attempted to address this. Why are there so many terrible wars, but there's no resolution? So you've had the Arab-Israeli wars, at least 5 of them. You've had 3 Persian Gulf wars. You've had massive bloodshed, millions of people killed, and yet often the same leaders are left in power, as we've seen even with the, not only with the Gulf Wars, but we've seen with post-Arab Spring as well. Despite enormous destruction, the region goes back to default in terms of the persistence of both these conflicts, but also these authoritarian regimes that underline them. So this is what I wanted to account for, drawing on three approaches in international relations theory. They're realism, liberal institutionalism, and constructivism. And now the dominant paradigm was this realist one, which explained this conflict as being balance of power between states, which are taken to be unitary rational actors. And this was a theory that was put forward by one of my professors, Stephen Walt, who wrote this book, Origins of Alliances. And he says that proved this realist model because you've had these Arab countries which shared common cultures, common language, history, but engaged in this kind of bitter, what Malcolm Kerr called the Arab Cold War, and that these balances were then maintained. Now, what I actually argued with him and questioned this, validity of this, pointing out that the conflicts could actually be explained in an ideational frame much better, which is to say that it wasn't just about balance of power, and the states were certainly not unitary state actors, because the regime and the state were not always consonant. And with the regime, often these regimes, counter the realist theory, did not seek to build strong unitary states. They purposely weakened their militaries, they purposely fragmented their societies by relying on certain particular groups or sects, like whether Saddam and the Tikriti Sunni mafia, or as we know, Hafiz al-Assad and the Alawite minority who staffed these security forces and so on. So, it was actually, what I argued was that often overlapping identity and anxiety that this created between authoritarian regimes over what Michael Hudson called the Arab quest for legitimacy often explained this. What I want to often explain this, what's interesting is how this identity frame has evolved over time. If you look at what I want to do is to look at how the international, the regional, and this domestic level often interacted in what I here show as these feedback loops between these three different levels. Just going to go over this a little faster here. And this is also linked to these 5 distinct conflict zones we have in the Middle East. We have the Arab-Israeli, we have the Greater Kurdistan, we have the Persian Gulf, and these are distinct conflict zones, but they often tend to overlap. So we looked at the recent Syria crisis, for example, and you have Iranian intervention, and the Iranian intervention was tied directly to their fears of having a lifeline to Hezbollah and a deterrent against Israel. And so this is where the different zones overlap. In terms of the Greater Kurdistan one, you had a budding Israeli-Saudi alliance that made use of this issue of Greater Kurdistan, and you actually even had this meeting in the Council on Foreign Relations between Dore Gold, Netanyahu's political advisor, and Saudi General Enver Eshki, where they talked about having creating a Kurdish belt because they viewed Turkey as an emerging threat. So let me go forward a little bit, since we're going to be a little short on time. But here we have the role of the periphery. So what do I mean by how has this changed? If you recall how this ideational model, contra the realist model, is explaining politics in the Middle East, Turkey, up until the emergence of the AKP party, was not considered directly part of the Middle East. Certainly that was not the perception of Turkish elites, who considered themselves to be part of Europe. And so David Ben-Gurion, in his strategy of the periphery, postulated that to keep the region fragmented and the balance of power maintained, you would have to seek alliance with the periphery, meaning Turkey or Iran, as well as ethnic minorities like the Kurds, the Maronites, and so on. To show that how the realist model doesn't really explain things fully, and we have to take this more ideational constructivist model, when Turkey changes its national orientation, identifies itself more with the region as part of this historic Islamic world and its Ottoman past, Turkey begins to be seen as a threat. The same thing happens vis-a-vis Iran. Iran was seen as a periphery, not as a threat, either by Israel or by Western powers in terms of maintaining the fragmentation of the region. Of course, the 1979 revolution changes that, and then you have this transformation, which explains a lot of the conflicts going forward today. And finally, you have this international level of intervention to keep the region fragmented. So there was a hope after the Cold War that the U.S. would change its policies as it did towards Latin America, where it promoted democracy, where it stopped intervening militarily. The U.S. has continued to intervene in the Middle East, and it has not supported democracy. There was a hope that it would support democracy post-Arab Spring, and Obama initially seemed to do that when he supported letting Mubarak fall. But very quickly, these deeper entrenched ideological and also realist material interests asserted themselves, and we saw that they did not support the democratic transition in Egypt. They betrayed, and it's very clear if you read David Kirkpatrick's recent book on this, is that they were afraid that spreading democracy would mean the wrong kinds of people, actually Islamist or Muslim nationalist and so on, would come to power. There was a fear that this would empower countries like Turkey as well. And so both in the case of Egypt and in the case of Syria, the U.S. let this Saudi-Israeli Emirati alliance overthrow the Arab Spring, help launch the bloody coups and the great sort of tragedies and bloodshed that we've seen going forward. Related to that was also, I should point out, the attempt to launch the coup against Turkey in 2016 very much was connected to this rollback of the Arab Spring, as was the isolation of Qatar. So that's the situation we find ourselves in today, and so I'm just going to the conclusion because we don't have a lot of time. But so what is to be done? How do we break out of this fragmented region where this kind of systemic conflict keeps recurring, there's no resolution? There's a simple answer to this, but it has to be a transformation. It has to be a continuation of this process of democratization in the region, which means that the counter-revolution cannot be seen as an endpoint. A similar process happened in Europe in 1848, but the counter-revolution that was launched in Springtime of Nations, the original Arab Spring, if you will, faced that setback, but it failed. It failed in a short period of time because the popular demands that were unleashed could not be suppressed permanently. And the similar situation, I would argue, exists in the Middle East. There has been this rollback in counter-revolution, but I don't think it's sustainable. I think just as the coup attempt in Turkey failed in 2016, we're seeing with the fallout in the Persian Gulf with Saudi Arabia today that this process is far from over. And it's the struggle, will continue and will be essential to change this cauldron of conflict that has been in place since Sykes-Picot a century ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Our second paper will be presented by Professor Massad. The title is Israel as Settler Colonial State, Implications for the Greater Middle East. Professor Massad will be talking about racialism and racialization, the ethnicization of religion in the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming again this late morning, and I'm happy to be giving my second paper at this conference. Thank you again for inviting me. The establishment of the Jewish settler colony in Palestine in 1948 would have a large and continuing impact not only on the Palestinian people, but also on the entire Middle East region for the next 7 decades, ranging from Zionist instigation of mass population movements in the region through different forms of expulsion to the rearrangement of local religious, geographic, and national identities, let alone local and international political alliances. The impact of the establishment of Israel and its policies have transformed the region in radical and unprecedented ways. However, Israel itself was a product of a movement and of imperial alliances that preceded and which were predicated on transforming the identities of European Jews and the entire Middle East region since the early 19th century. I will address some of these transformations, especially as relates to the question of the politics of identity, which was always a central question for the Zionist movement itself and for the imperial powers that supported and continue to support it. European schemes to undermine the Ottoman Sultanate since the articulation of the Eastern question aimed to weaken the Ottomans from within. As my colleague has already explained, the Sultanate, which had more Christian than Muslim subjects, had to be torn apart to ensure its final defeat. Initially, this would be undertaken through the fostering of nationalism among the varied linguistic Christian groups among the populations, extending from Greece to Bulgaria to Serbia westwards and to the Armenians eastwards. Once this was carried out, the plan became one of fostering nationalism among the varied Muslim populations of the empire, especially the Arabs, to reduce the Ottomans to a Turkish state fostered by Turkish nationalism in the wake of World War I. The manipulation of religious and linguistic differences into new forms of national identity would have a lasting impact on the Balkans as well as on Turkey and the rest of the Middle East. The British would articulate the secessionism and subdivisions in the name of ending so-called Ottoman despotism and supporting the so-called freedom of people and the right to rule themselves. The Zionist colonial settler project was also based on 19th century European principles of nationalism, racialism, and colonialism. Following the Protestant Reformation and the 18th century philology, which culminated in the second half of the 19th century in the rise of racialism and anti-Semitism as a movement that targeted European Jews as a race and a nationality and not as a religion, the Zionist movement accepted anti-Semitic racialism and adopted it as a basis for its new nationalist and colonial project. It is from this point of departure that immediately upon the establishment of the Jewish settler colony in 1948, the new state embarked on racializing and ethnicizing the Palestinian indigenous population over whom it came to rule in accordance with its criteria. British imperial support for the Zionists was motivated by Protestant Zionism and by anti-Semitism, but the core motivation was the war against Russian communism, which European anti-Semitic propaganda depicted as a Jewish revolution and as a Jewish takeover of Russia, and even, as Winston Churchill would put it, of Western civilization itself. The fight against so-called Jewish communism was identified by Churchill as a central mission, the solution to which he found in an anti-communist Zionism. Indeed, British officials after the war understood the situation only in anti-Semitic and anti-communist terms. Supporting Zionism, they calculated, would obtain the support of rich American Jews for the British Empire and steer away the rest of American Jewry from communist revolution. You see this in the debates that went on with high-ranking British officials and high-ranking Zionist officials at the time. Moreover, as Zionism, like British anti-Ottoman imperial policy, understood religion as a form of nationality and ethnicity, the British considered it part and parcel of its post-war plans for the region. After all, now that all erstwhile Ottoman identities had been truncated to national and sub-national identities that were easier to manage, the same strategy should work across the new Arab region by subdividing the Arabs into smaller geographical and religious-based identities. Thus, while the British had supported the rise of Arab nationalism against the Ottomans since the 1870s in the name of freedom, in the wake of World War I, the plan became one of dividing the Arabs in the name of imperial interests. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration were both designed to bring about this effect. Following on these key principles, after its establishment, the Israeli state not only legislated that Jews were a separate nation, but it also stipulated that the Palestinian Muslim Druze sect was not Arab or Muslim, but a separate ethnicity altogether. Something it also did for Palestinian Bedouin tribes, which it considered as a separate ethnicity from the rest of the Palestinian people altogether. Israel's ongoing attempts to separate Palestinian Muslims and Christians, however, have met with the least success, and not for lack of effort. The principle of racial, ethnic, religious, and geographic divisions and separatism that was codified in Israeli law and is still operative today has had a result has had, as a result, a most deleterious impact on the Palestinian people's rights to their lands, language, culture, and their struggle for emancipation. Zionist religious and ethnic separatism began in Palestine in the 1920s when the Zionist colonists insisted on setting up a separatist economy and Jews-only colonies, not only in the agricultural colonies the movement established, but also in urban Palestinian neighborhoods. Its first success took place immediately after World War I, under British sponsorship, namely when it separated northern Jaffa from the rest of the city and created in 1921 the separate municipality of Tel Aviv, a Jews-only neighborhood that was free of Arabs. Tel Aviv is to date the only racially and ethnically pure city in the Middle East, inhabited almost entirely by Jews. Tel Aviv would swallow up Jaffa's municipality in 1950 after Israel had expelled the majority of Jaffa's Palestinian population. In addition, the Zionist movement and its imperial sponsors had their eyes on the larger region and sought sectarian and ethnic political movements which shared their vision of the identities of indigenous populations or were receptive to these colonial separatist ideas. What assisted the Israelis in their efforts was the policies followed by the European colonial powers since the 19th century, which had aimed to transform local identities along narrow nationalist lines and had an interest in initially mobilizing and later undermining the largest form of collective identity in the region, namely Arabness. Arabness, which began to consolidate itself in the last third of the 19th century with the help of British imperialism, was mobilized against the Ottomans in ways not unlike how Greek, Bulgarian, and Armenian nationalisms had been instigated. Since the end of World War I, all the way to the 1950s and 60s, when the movement reached its apogee, European and American imperialism sought to destroy its project once and for all. The Zionists became active players in this imperial project and indeed would be the ones to deliver the final blow to Arab nationalism with their victory in the 1967 war. The Zionist colonial conquest was focused since the movement's early days on finding allies in the region that shared their philosophy that religion was a form of ethnicity and nationality, if not race. Zionism's early relations with the Lebanese Maronite Church in the mid-1940s involved devising plans for setting up a separatist Christian Lebanese state that would be an ally to the future Jewish state, both politically and in its commitment to sectarianism and de-Arabization of non-Sunni Muslim Arabs. Here, Israel's and right-wing Maronites, including the church leadership, agreed that the Arabic-speaking Maronites who originated in the Syrian hinterland and who lived in Mount Lebanon and not on the coast were in fact not Arab at all, but remnants of the Semitic Phoenicians who in fact had inhabited the ancient Mediterranean coastal region, part of modern Lebanon and Palestine today, and not the Syrian hinterland. I suspect Maronite nationalists would be horrified to think of coastal Palestinians as Phoenicians rather than they themselves being so, assuming one would actually give any credence to these kinds of racialist categories. Israel and the imperial powers provided much military and ideological assistance to this ethnicizing and de-Arabizing separatist trend in Lebanon, assistance which would be one of the major factors in the U.S. intervention in the country in 1958 to secure it from the threat of Arab nationalism, and which later brought about a civil war in the mid-1970s and two Israeli invasions in 1978 and 1982 in support of religious separatism that all together caused the death of at least 120,000 Lebanese and Palestinians by the time the war ended in 1990. Israel continued to support this separatist project for the next 10 years during its occupation of southern Lebanon and its sponsorship of a mercenary army it called the South Lebanon Army. Equally important, Zionism targeted the different Arab Jewish communities and insisted on denationalizing them, even though many amongst them had been Egyptian, Iraqi, or Moroccan nationalists. Its efforts of emptying the Arab world of Jews were most successful, as Arab nationalism and often country-specific nationalisms accepted Zionist claims that Jews are a nation and an ethnicity, and that they belong to the Jewish nation and not to their own countries, and they accepted that Zionism speaks for them. French colonialism was a pioneer in this regard when it had separated in 1870 Algerian Jews from Algerian Muslims and transformed the former from indigenous Algerians into French colons by granting them French citizenship, which was mentioned earlier today as well. This Zionist identitarian project had gone hand in hand with the earlier European colonial efforts to de-Arabize Egypt, which gave rise to Egyptian nationalism between the late 19th century and the post-World War I period that separated itself from the rest of the Arab world and disavowed Arabness. Egyptology and archaeology were and remain the colonial knowledge that constitute the cornerstone of the new Egyptian identity. The triumph of a non-Arab Egyptian nationalism during this period made it possible for some Egyptian Jews to claim that until the 1940s they could be both Zionists and Egyptian nationalists simultaneously, and that there was no contradiction between the two. This form of Egyptian nationalism, however, receded significantly between the mid-1930s and mid-1970s, only to rise again after the 1967 war and Anwar Sadat's new alliance a decade later with Israel and his pro-Israeli renewal of the project to de-Arabize Egypt and undo the Nasserist legacy. Indeed, the Egyptian situation got even more complicated ever since the Sadatist regime unleashed sectarian Salafist forces whose sectarian views and violent targeting of the Egyptian Coptic population generated a new dynamic in Coptic identity. While Egyptian Muslims, even if separated from other Arabs by Sadat's de-Arabization campaign, remained connected to the region through their Muslim religious identity, the de-Arabization of Egypt affected the Coptic community differently, especially in the context of increased sectarian attacks on Christians by the Sadat regime and some Salafists. This led to the strengthening of separatist sectarian trends within the Coptic community, especially in the US diaspora, where anti-Muslim Coptic separatists have followed in the footsteps of Lebanese Maronite separatists and allied themselves closely with pro-Israel and Zionist forces in the United States, while championing the cause of Egyptian Copts as a non-Arab, non-Muslim minority like Israeli Jews. Indeed, the separatist cause has become so strong in Egyptian liberal circles today that some liberal Muslim Egyptians today identify themselves as Copts ethnically as opposed to Arab. To counter an anti-imperial Arab nationalism and other leftist anti-imperial regimes and movements in Muslim-majority countries, which the US feared would join the communist bloc, US imperial policy began to support jihadist forms of Islam and Muslim identity, an effort which would begin in the 1950s to overthrow Indonesia's President Sukarno by jihadists and to overthrow President Nasser through the anti-communist Muslim Brotherhood, but without success. The US subcontracted the Islamist mission to the Saudis, who sponsored a variety of projects that insisted that Islam and not Arabness should be the identity of the entire region. With Sadat's support for Islamist groups in Egypt and continuing Saudi sponsorship of jihadism, this effort would yield important results in the decades to come by undermining Arab national identity in favor of country-specific nationalisms and religious-based identities. The Iranian Revolution, though issuing from an anti-imperial ideology, would help in pushing for the coupling of national and religious identities. The latest major imperial and Israeli effort to further subdivide local identities would come about in the context of the American invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. The US occupation authorities insisted on replicating past imperial and Israeli identitarian strategies. Iraq's American governor, Paul Bremer, immediately divided Iraqis into Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds, as if all three identities were ethnic and national identities and carried the same valence. While Kurdish national identity was always part of the linguistic and ethnic mosaic of the region, Sunni and Shiite Muslims were never differentiated as ethnic identities prior to the American invasion. Like the British before them, the Americans undertook these new divisions in the name of freedom from dictatorship and as support for democracy. Meanwhile, the Saudi regime had been most concerned about Iranian influence since the victory of the Lebanese resistance led by Hezbollah in 2000 against Israel, and which forced the Israeli army to withdraw and end its occupation of South Lebanon in utter defeat. The palpable influence Iran was acquiring in US-occupied Iraq by 2004 was judged by the Saudis as another threat that necessitated the intensification of Israeli-style ethnicization of religions. Suddenly, the king of Jordan, King Abdullah, declared his concern about the appearance of a so-called Shiite crescent extending from Iran to Iraq to Syria and Lebanon. American, Saudi, and Israeli-sponsored propaganda began spreading anti-Shiite sectarianism across the region, identifying Iraqi and Lebanese Shiites with Iranians. The campaign would also target Bahraini, Saudi, and Kuwaiti Shiites. Forgotten was the fact that the Iraqi army that fought Iran between 1980 and 1988 was a majority Shiite army. The campaign intensified after Hezbollah defeated the invading Israelis in 2006. This sectarian campaign would be further resuscitated after 2011 when the Qataris and Al Jazeera television station joined the fray in supporting some of the more sectarian segments that accelerated the transformation of the Syrian uprising against the Assad dictatorship into a bloody Syrian civil war. Syrian Alawites were next in line to be demonized and identified with an undemocratic and dictatorial regime. Israel had an active role in much of this, especially in the Syrian war and in the anti-Shiite sectarianism that targeted its arch-enemy, Iran. In the last 7 years, and as a new strategy to defeat Iran, the Israelis and the Americans devised a new and unprecedented terminology, namely what they call today Sunni Arab states, modeling their new neologism on Israel's own Jewish separatist identity with its religious and ethnic dimensions. It is in this context that ISIS, or Daesh, emerged as a sectarian arm of this trend, aiming to establish an Orthodox Muslim state whose entire population had to adhere to its version of Islam. While the majority of those whom ISIS killed were Sunni Muslims, the Israelis and the Western press would highlight only its Christian, Shiite, and Yazidi victims to further entrench and separate religious identities as ethnic and national ones. Concomitant with this development, the Israeli and American roles in dividing Sudan into North and South, African Arabs and African non-Arabs, Christians and Muslims, were paramount. The result has been the failed state of South Sudan and the civil war since 2013 that has cost and is costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Some of the estimates are of 400,000 dead. The same applies to the Saudi invasion of Yemen, which has cost tens of thousands of deaths, and the ongoing Saudi attempts to divide Yemenis along sectarian lines. In the course of the last century and a half, the identities of all the populations in the Middle East region have been transformed in the name of freedom as a cover for imperial interests. Western colonial powers, and after them the Zionist movement, supported by the US and the West Europeans, have sought to subdivide all existing identities into smaller and more parochial ones to eliminate all threats to imperial control. Israel's settler colonial project, predicated on preserving colonial and racial privileges of its Jewish population and their parochial 19th century identity, has become the model that the entire region is enjoined to emulate as a way forward to ensure the preservation and safeguarding of imperial interests in the 21st century. The project of rendering Syria a religiously cleansed, purely Sunni state has so far failed. But the production of so-called Sunni Arab states lined up against Shiite Iran and its non-Sunni Arab allies does not augur well for the future of the region. Today, there are upwards of 300 million Arabs who are Sunni Muslims and upwards of 65 million Arabs who are not Sunni Muslims. The US, Israel, and their Saudi allies aim to continue to sponsor sectarianism and separatism in order to further divide the region into smaller and smaller states that identify religion and religious sects as nationalities and ethnicities in an effort to continue the process they started in the early 19th century in the Ottoman Empire. Israel is the model. The plan is to transform all Arab countries into pale copies of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Massad. Excellent timing. Thank you very much for that, and very informative paper. Excellent. And our last paper will be presented by Professor Sami Al-Arian on titled Dissecting American Hegemony Across the Muslim World. Clicker. Occupied.
The title of my talk today is Dissecting American Hegemony Across the Muslim World. The last two speakers are excellent introduction for me to delve into this topic. The presentation will attempt to trace the geopolitical and strategic imperatives of the American empire and its hegemonic power worldwide. I'd like you to understand where that power is coming from. As Pax Americana replaced Pax Britannica in the aftermath of World War II, in the midst of the Cold War, the US deepened its engagement and involvement across the Muslim world, based on its strategic economic security and cultural interests, and in many instances, without any regard to its lofty rhetoric of the will of the people of the region. The presentation will attempt to explain the sources and impact of the power from Trump to Truman. So from Truman to Trump, rather. The US grand strategy and its broader objectives in the Middle East, West Asia, and beyond. The presentation, however, will be incomplete because in 20 minutes I can't cover everything I would like to cover. So much of the American power will be explained, but the weaknesses of that power will be omitted, not because it's not important, simply because of the lack of time. We'll try to understand this from the American strategist and decision maker. See how that power is utilized, how it's used, and how it perpetuates the empire. What do empires do? Imperialism is what empires do. Is there a microphone that I can walk around instead of just staying here? Imperialism is the process by which the imperial country uses its enormous economic and military power against other nations in order to expropriate their lands, exploit their labor, control their natural resources, capital, and economic life, and open their markets in such a manner as to enrich themselves and advance their interests. Here's a map. The United States is only about, from land mass, about 6% of the world, from population about 4.5% of the world. Yet, as we progress through this, you would find that its impact is much more overwhelming than its size. U.S. objectives in the world and the Middle East, they have strategic and security factors, economic interests, political hegemony, cultural, social, and religious factors. Now, what are these strategic and security imperatives? How do Americans, those who make decisions, look at themselves? This started about over 200 years ago. This empire came through about a century and a half. They started with the 13 states on the East Coast, basically, and then going through many wars that I don't have time to go through, exterminating natives, British wars, the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, about 1/4 of the U.S., Spanish wars, Mexican wars, other kinds of wars, in which they secured basically the continental, what we call today the continental United States, and that's an important factor because that federal system is a central system, and they give them a lot of leverage in controlling land mass that is very rich. This is the first imperative. This is the first factor. The second one was what is termed as Monroe Doctrine, which is to make sure that there will be no threat coming from the South, from South America. So not only securing America in terms of also its neighbors, where they basically neutralized Canada and Mexico, that there would be no threat coming from there, but also from the South, South America, that they would not allow any foreign power to have any kind of military leverage or military strength in the South. The third one was to secure the oceans. As you see here, it's not very clear, but you have the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and to do that, that means they have to have a strong navy. And that's what they did for the first 50 years, was to this is an empire now, build an empire. They built a very strong navy, and today the Navy of the United States is much stronger in terms of manpower as well as equipment than the whole navies of the world. Of course, they were still challenged by the British Navy up to World War II, and that's what came after that, what's called Lend-Lease, where they took basically all the naval power or the naval bases of the British in exchange for giving them money after World War II when they were bankrupt. The fourth imperative or strategic doctrine is to control trade routes. throughout the world. That's what the US does. And for that, they had to build that navy not only to defend the United States, but to be basically in charge of all the oceans of the world. And for that, they built this navy that today control any part and with no challenge, basically. And I will show some of the data later on. The fifth doctrine was never to allow, now that they have built this world power, never to allow any Eurasian, because Latin America, Africa, rest of the world, Australia, they don't basically challenge, never to allow any emerging power in the Eurasia region, in Europe or Asia. That means, and they coin that as balance of power. So if there is any emerging power, if the Soviet Union at the time, obviously with a different thing, if they want to challenge American power, they will have to have different problems around their borders in order to make them busy with them and never to challenge the United States. That explains what happened in Ukraine. That explains what happens for Iran. That when any emerging power that's trying to have more power outside their borders, that's what they're going to face. That's what happens in many conflicts in the 60s and the 70s. It could be explained that way. That's what happened today in northern Syria. So to summarize, then the U.S. grand strategy, objectives, and doctrines: first, secure North America; to dominate South America; Navy supremacy over the Atlantic and the Pacific; control over all oceans and trade routes; preventing any Eurasian state or combination of states from becoming too powerful or challenging U.S. hegemony. And finally, where nobody really talks about that, just Trump actually tripped his hand, to have complete dominance of space, because this is where they think future wars would be. So these are the 6 doctrines that the decision maker has in their minds, the Pentagon basically, and those strategists, while they are executing policies. In many instances, we're totally unaware of this, and we make decisions not based on where their interests are. Now, if you look at this, this is the Navy. This is what's being, this is in 2015 and extrapolated in 2020. These are about 384. Actually, they came, during Reagan was 600, but this is much more advanced. Over 300, actually, they passed 300 last year of ships deployed all over the world. These are military bases. We're talking about bases in 70 countries around the world and military presence. This is, how the different commands are controlling basically the different regions of the world. They have basically 10 fleets, 7 always active, 3 on reserve, while, Russia has 1, China has 1, Britain maybe has half, and France 1. So there is really no competition when it comes to the control of these oceans and the trade routes. Here is a depiction of these bases around the world. All these are countries, as I said, over 70 countries. Compare that with Britain, just some Commonwealth countries. Compare that with French, just some African countries that were Franco-African countries. Compare that with Russia. Russia, 30 years ago, they had all kinds of client states around in the Middle East, from Algeria to Libya to Iraq to Egypt to Yemen to Syria. Now only Syria and Vietnam. Compare that to China, which has very little presence in Djibouti just a couple of years ago. So there is really no competition when you look at the United States versus Russia. They both have in Mongolia and little here and little there. So they are basically encircling all the potential challengers to U.S. empire. Here's an example. Here's Iran. Now, if you're sitting in Tehran, this is what you're looking at. 37 bases, just around. That does not even include the different naval navies, around. So obviously that's total encirclement. These are the naval, and this is the naval bases, and these are the air bases. That does not even include 13 bases in northern Syria. This is 2 years ago. This was 10. Now it's 13. And this is basically for Turkey. Turkey as an emerging power. So the best way, again, the balance of power is to create a state or a power that could challenge Turkey. And that's exactly how we can understand the arming of 30,000 Kurds. It's not about ISIS. ISIS is gone. Why are they there? Why they are arming them with this heavy weaponry and training them and getting them ready? Basically so that Turkey would be busy with them and would not think about how to challenge or how to build a navy. They think 50 years ahead. Who could be challenging us 50 years from now? They start, engaging them. It's a misnomer, but it's called balance of power. That's what happened between Iraq and Iran. That's what happens throughout different wars, as you see, as these ethnic wars that Professor Massad was talking about. So maintaining political hegemony and economic control by building, this came basically in the aftermath of World War II, is to build architecture, political architectures, military alliances, setting the rules like UN, NATO, American Organization of American States, and so on and so forth. They set the rules, they control them. This is on the political hegemony side. On the economic side, it's even worse. You know, in Bretton Woods, 1944, they were winning. Everybody else was basically losing, even if they thought they were winning. And they thought, they basically said, okay, we're going to make the dollar as the currency of the world. So they said, you can, if you have dollars, I can exchange that for gold anytime you want as a set price. And that meant that everybody can be secure in having the dollar. But Nixon came in 1971 because they kept printing the dollars without any gold that would cover it. And when the gold started asking what's happening here, they said, okay, we're not going to use it, but we're going to maintain the dollar as the currency of the world. How were they able to do that? They went to Saudi Arabia, basically says, the biggest exporter of oil. They had this problem in 1973, and then the price of oil went from 183 to, within 2 years, to 1150. And it had to be in dollars. For that, we give you protection. It's not whether we have access to the oil, whether the oil is going to be sold in dollar. That was the agreement. That's what Kissinger got from the Saudis, the promise. We give you protection, it's in dollar. Now, who prints the dollar? Who owns the oil? The one who prints the dollar. You have 85 million barrels a day that are being exchanged, that are being sold totally in dollars. That means they are the owners of that. So they created, different systems also to control this. In terms of IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organizations, they set the rules. They even create the International Criminal Court without being part to it. So that will be a threat to other regimes, like in African presidents and African regimes, so that whenever they want, they can use these tools. That's what empires do. Oil is sold in dollar, as I said, completely. I will show you some of these figures. Here's the proposed budget for the US, $4.2 trillion. Don't be deceived, because Social Security, unemployment, Medicare, health, interest on the debt, all that doesn't count. That's all automatic. This is the real budget. 61% of that budget goes to the military. $727 billion. That's what maintains an empire. That's what is being the world threatened with. Military spending, look at United States versus others. 48% of all military spending in the world is what is being spent by the United States. Here's another figure from 2016. While the US 2 years ago, just 611, look at Saudi Arabia. That's a client state. These equipment will never be used by the Saudis. These are reserve equipment for the US Army. Same with the Emirates. Combined, 63 and 22, you talk about almost close to $90+ billion. And that's every year. Now where did you get that money from? What gives them that power? They just simply print money. It's the only country in the world that can print money and get away with it. No inflation, nothing. Look at some small figures. When Bill Clinton was a president, when Reagan was a president, actually, here, 1987, right there, it was the first trillion during Reagan. Now, by Clinton, it became 5.6. Obama, 11.5, George W. Bush, 11.5, 20 trillion, this coming 25 trillion. Just keep printing with no consequence. That's because they are the only country that can basically set the rules. They can do it and get away with it. While they have, here is one, their trade is about $4 trillion, 23% of the world, almost 63% is in US dollars. What is this about? This is why there are certain wars, certain countries get attacked and deposed. One of the reasons Saddam Hussein, I believe in the main reason Saddam Hussein was deposed is because he was adamant in selling oil without, in euros or other currencies. So here's the oil, for instance. That's how much it is, about $800 billion. Most of it, you could see, some of these countries, all in dollars. US is number 20. So that's a source of its strength. Very quickly, when we talk about the United States, we're not talking about all the people. 1% of the people. I'm sorry, 0.1% in the United States, 0.1% on 22%, 10%, 1% on 40% of the wealth in the US, and 10%, 75%. These are the people who control the world and control the empire. So US strategic objectives in the Middle East are protecting Israel, military superiority, controlling oil and currency stability, military bases, the Suez Canal. There are many questions. I don't have time to go through them. Examples, weapon sales and markets, preventing any attempts toward unity, independence, fighting political Islam, any ideology that would be opposed to US control, cultural hegemony, political influence. Now, what are the tools? Economic incentives and trade deals doesn't work. Economic aid doesn't work. Military aid doesn't work. Advisors or intervention, soft power, hard power. We have different examples. Okay. So I'm going to skip this about Palestine. This is the Muslim world. You could see that the United States, in many of the problems that we have, it's party to most of the problems. You know, whether it was Iraq-Iran war, yes, there are many. I'm not discounting the fact that there are problems here. But Iraq, in many instances, Saddam Hussein was encouraged to attack Iran as he was encouraged to attack Kuwait. And on both sides, with 8 wars, they were actually supporting both. If one side gets weak, they support it so that they continue that. As Professor Massad says, you know, about this, it happens in Syria. It happens, of course, the empowerment of Israel is paramount. And the whole idea here is to, as Israeli strategist, and it's printed now, Oded Yonan, who was an advisor to Sharon, and I translated actually a speech by Sharon in 1983. We termed it the new map of the Middle East, in which he was advocating making the Middle East, instead of 20, the Arab world, instead of 22 countries, 35 countries. So that is the grand strategy, and the United States is going along with it, and basically to fragment this region further. Now, this is happening by creating a new enemy called Iran. So they wanted to do, so what we have today is an alliance that's got, you know, the United States, some of the Sunni Arab states, as well as Israel, in trying to redefine the region by creating sectarian war. This is very dangerous. And this is, you know, this is the Sunni versus Shia composition in the area. Neither the Sunnis will be able to exterminate the Shias, and vice versa, definitely not. So what we have, the challenge is, this is a US empire. Empires seek strategic dominance and control, impose their will, eliminate the challenge, exploit and control resources. Part of their strategy is to protect and enable Israel, and we heard about the danger of that, and I skipped actually my part about why Israel is so dangerous to the area. And part of that is to neutralize its enemies. And they've done that over and over and over again. And much of what's happening in terms of the financial banking system, how it's being turned after 9/11 to target certain people, certain groups, certain countries, attest to that. Much of what's happening in the region today has traces back to Israel, including the Arab Spring. And I didn't even mention the Arab Spring and how that was so dangerous to the American hegemony, because it gives back the will to the people. It gives them back to be in charge of their own destiny. So maintaining hegemony through supporting corrupt and autocratic regimes, fighting any emerging power or ideology that seek political empowerment, economic independence, or military strength. That includes the Arab Spring phenomena, that includes what's happening to Turkey today, in many instances, whether on the political side, military side, or economic, and what's happening to Iran. And I do not minimize one bit that there are projects here and projects there, that Iran had made so many mistakes. I'm looking at the bigger picture. We're not going to eliminate Iran, and we're not going to eliminate, and they're not going to eliminate us. But what's happening here is there's a bigger project at play here that is going through country by country, because that is, as one of the strategists, George Friedman, says, that the United States, when it has enemies, try to divide them, ally with the weak, hit the strong, go back and hit the other. And he gives the examples of Britain and France during the early days, and Hitler and Stalin during the World War II. So response for the challenge, we need unity, that really should go beyond anything else. We need to minimize differences and try to unite our efforts. Resistance with all, whatever that means, with all aspects, and cultural, political, and economic independence, including the suggestions provided by Mujeeb here about democracy, the importance of it, the rule of law, maintaining human rights. This whole project that needs to be maintained and developed. That comes through vision, will, and action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Al-Arian. Excellent timing again. First, I would like to start asking by questions, and then I will open the floor for questions, and I will get all the questions. Then I will leave the floor again for you to answer the questions. My first question is to Dr. Khan. In your presentation, you focused on the realist, liberal, and constructivist factors explaining conflict in the region. I wonder how can you answer the question why there is a lack of cooperation in the region by looking at the similar factors, by changing the question, because you talked about ancient hatreds and